Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another plunge into the depths of philosophical thought?
Always. And this time, we're diving into something, well, pretty close to home.
You could say that. It's something we all do, all the time. But as usual, things aren't quite as simple as they appear. We're talking about attention.
And to guide our exploration, we've got a great map. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on attention is going to be our main guide for this deep dive. It's really an incredible resource, incredibly comprehensive, with insights from all across the history of thought on this topic.
So if you're a philosophy enthusiast, you're in for a treat. We're going to unpack the philosophical complexities of attention. It's not just a psychological phenomenon. It has big implications for understanding knowledge, consciousness, action, and even value.
Exactly. Ready to dive in.
Absolutely. So let's start in the beginning. What were some of the early philosophical questions and problems that thinkers were trying to tackle with this idea of attention? What were they hoping to explain?
Well, one of the things that's really striking is the variety of explanatory roles that attention was given early on. Different thinkers saw it as a key to solving different philosophical puzzles.
Like Descartes, for example. In his meditations, he's wrestling with doubt. How do we know anything for sure when we can doubt pretty much everything? And attention plays a key role for him in resolving this.
Right. He says that even though we can initially doubt everything, when we focus our attention on clear and distinct ideas, well, that's what gives us certainty. That's what convinces us of their truth. So attention is crucial for establishing a foundation for knowledge, at least for Descartes.
So right from the start, attention is seen as this active force. It's not just passively receiving information, it's actively shaping how we understand the world and ground our knowledge. Then you have Berkeley, over in his Principles of Human Knowledge. He tackles this very tricky issue of abstract ideas, specifically in his disagreement with Locke over general concepts. Like, how can we even have an idea of a triangle in general?
And for Berkeley, attention is the key. He argues that we achieve this by focusing on certain aspects of a particular idea, like a specific triangle we're looking at, and ignoring others. So it's this selective focus that allows us to abstract away from particular instances and arrive at a more general concept. Attention is the engine of abstraction for him.
Interesting. So both Descartes and Berkeley see attention as crucial for understanding how we know things, even if their approaches differ. Now, Locke, in his essay concerning human understanding, actually gives us a more explicit definition of attention, calling it a mode of thinking.
Yes, he describes it as this way of taking notice and registering ideas in our memory. And he distinguishes it from simply letting our minds wander, what we might call reverie, and also from intentionally setting out to do something.
But what's really interesting about Locke's view, this modal view, is that it suggests attention isn't some basic fundamental mental activity on its own. It's more like a particular way that thinking happens. It doesn't explain thinking itself.
Exactly. It's more like saying that reading carefully is how reading happens.
Yeah.
It doesn't really explain what reading is in the first place. It presupposes it.
But this more limited view of attention didn't really stick around, did it? Over the 18th and 19th centuries, things started to change.
You're right. Attention started to be seen as something that needed its own explanation. It became a phenomenon in its own right.
And its role expanded beyond thinking. Philosophers started to see it as involved in perception, action, memory, all these other mental processes.
Right. Christian Wolff was one of the first to really dedicate a whole section of his work, his psychology textbook from 1738, specifically to attention. And Dugald Stewart later argued that attention is absolutely crucial, not just for storing memories, but for being able to recall them. He even used the example of jugglers, highlighting how attention is at play even in very complex, skillful actions.
So by the 19th century, the understanding of attention really broadened. But with this came a whole bunch of new psychological theories, all trying to nail down exactly what attention was.
Right. You have people like Titchener really focusing on its role in perception, how it shapes what we see and hear. Then you have Bain emphasizing the connection to action, how attention guides our movements. And Stout highlights its importance for thinking, especially focused, deliberate thought. So it becomes this kind of messy, chaotic period in terms of theoretical development.
Which kind of naturally led to attempts to simplify things, to try and rein in the complexity. This is where the deflationary theories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries come in.
Yeah, the idea was to say, hey, maybe attention isn't this mysterious fundamental faculty that needs a really complicated explanation.
William James, in his super influential Principles of Psychology, is the poster child for this approach. He famously said, "Volition is nothing but attention." and he tried to break down attention to these very concrete components.
He talked about adjusting our sensory organs, things like turning our eyes or ears towards something. And then there's this anticipatory preparation of what he calls our ideational centers, which is basically, imagination. He uses a great example from Helmholtz about picking out specific overtones in a piano chord. To do that, you have to actively imagine what that overtone would sound like on its own.
So it's a very grounded, almost physical view of attention.
Exactly. And then you have F.H. Bradley, who also took a kind of deflationary approach. But he went even further and said, attention isn't even a specific mental activity at all. He claimed any function, whether it's of the body or the mind, becomes active attention when it's driven by our interest and we're really engaged with the outcome.
It sounds a bit like Locke's idea of attention as a mode, doesn't it?
It does. They both suggest that attention isn't about what specific mental processes are happening, but how they're happening. Whether they're driven by interest, whether we're consciously aware of them.
Okay, and to round out this early period, we have Theodore Ribot, who actually foreshadowed behaviorism by focusing on the observable behavioral signs of attention. He wasn't really interested in internal mental states, just the outward manifestations.
And speaking of behaviorism, when that became the dominant school of thought in the 20th century, attention didn't really get a lot of attention. It wasn't completely ignored, but it wasn't a central focus. But things changed again with the rise of cognitive psychology, and that's where we get this whole idea of an information processing bottleneck.
Right, the big name here is Donald Broadbent, with his bottleneck model. He proposed that we have these two serial stages of processing, with a limited capacity channel in between. So information has to pass through this bottleneck one piece at a time, and this forces us to be selective.
And this idea of a bottleneck of limited processing capacity became a really dominant way of thinking about attention for decades to come. But it's really important to remember that Broadbent himself was cautious about directly equating this model with our everyday concept of attention. He actually preferred terms like selective perception. His main goal was to understand the structure of information processing, to find that bottleneck, more than giving a philosophical account of what attention is.
So the focus shifted to trying to figure out where this bottleneck was located. Does it happen early on in perceptual processing, filtering out information before it's even fully analyzed? Or does it happen later, affecting what reaches our conscious awareness? This brings us to the heart of contemporary theories of attention.
Right. This debate about the bottleneck's location led to what we call capacity limitation theories. And the main distinction here is between early selection and late selection theories.
Early selection theories, building on Broadbent's work, say the bottleneck is early, so we only fully process the stuff we're directly attending to.
Right. We might pick up on basic features of unattended stuff, like whether something is bright or loud, but we don't really analyze its meaning. So if you're completely absorbed in our conversation right now, you might hear a dog barking outside, but you wouldn't know what breed it was unless you shifted your attention to it.
Makes sense. So what about late selection theories?
They argue that the brain actually processes, at least to some degree, pretty much all the information coming in. The bottleneck, they say, is much later, and what attention really does is determine what becomes conscious and what gets stored in working memory.
So it's more about selecting what we become aware of, not what gets processed in the first place.
Exactly. Jesse Prince, a contemporary philosopher, actually aligns with this late selection view. He sees attention as this process of projecting already processed information into working memory, and he argues that this is what makes it conscious.
But of course, that raises the question of whether this single mechanism can really account for everything we think of as attention.
Right. Defining attention is half the battle when it comes to theorizing about it. And it's worth pointing out that even though there's evidence that some semantic processing of unattended stuff does happen, the very strong version of late selection has been challenged. Brain imaging studies have shown that even early sensory areas in the brain show differences in activity depending on whether we're paying attention.
So it's not just about a late-stage filter. Attention seems to be influencing things earlier on as well. But how do we reconcile this with the early selection evidence?
Well, Nili Lavi's load theory offers a pretty elegant solution. She proposes that the location of the bottleneck isn't fixed. It actually depends on the perceptual load of what we're doing. If we're doing something that demands a lot of our perceptual resources, the bottleneck happens early. But if the task is easier, the bottleneck shifts later. It's like when you're really focused on something complex, your attention narrows, but when things are more relaxed, it broadens.
Okay, so it's not just early or late. It's dynamic and depends on what we're doing. That makes a lot of intuitive sense. But this whole idea of a single bottleneck has been questioned as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, some theories suggest there might be multiple bottlenecks or even distributed limitations across the whole processing system. This takes us away from that simple linear model of information flow. And, those terms, early and late, become a bit problematic when we consider that the brain doesn't necessarily process things in a strictly sequential way. It's much more parallel and complex than that.
You're right. Our attempts to create neat models often bump up against the messy reality of the brain. Speaking of messy realities, let's talk about Anne Treisman's feature integration theory. This is the one that deals with the binding problem, right?
Yes, the binding problem is a really fundamental issue in perception. How do all these separate features that the brain processes, things like color, shape, motion, get combined into our experience of a unified object? How does the brain know that the redness belongs to the tomato and the greenness to the apple?
Treisman's theory proposes that attention is what solves this. It's the glue that binds those features together.
Exactly. And this theory has implications beyond just perception. John Campbell, for example, has used it to think about demonstrative reference, how we use words like that to pick out specific objects. And even Treisman herself suggested, although cautiously, that it might help us understand the unity of consciousness.
But not everyone agrees that there is a binding problem, right? Some philosophers say it's a kind of pseudo-problem, that it arises from our assumptions about how the brain represents information.
That's right. There's a whole debate about whether we even need a specific binding mechanism. Some argue that our experience of integrated objects might just emerge naturally from the way the brain processes information. But even if the general binding problem is contested, the idea that attention plays some kind of integrative role, especially in specific situations like multisensory integration, where we're combining information from different senses, is still pretty compelling.
So attention might not be a universal feature combiner, but it could still be doing something important in specific contexts. Now let's shift gears and look at coherence theories. These seem to have a more action-oriented view of attention.
Yeah, they emphasize the role of attention in selecting among all the possible actions and thoughts we could engage in. Thinkers like Stout saw thinking itself as a kind of action, and he said this requires active attention to keep us on track.
And Wayne Wu has really developed this line of thinking with his selection for action theory. He talks about the many problem, which is basically the fact that we have tons of potential actions available at any given time. Attention, in this view, is what allows us to pick one coherent course of action and suppress all the competing possibilities.
Right. It's less about managing limited processing capacity, like Broadbent's view, and more about managing an excess of possibilities. It's about preventing interference between all the things we could be doing. Even involuntary attention, like when we get startled, can be seen as a shift in our readiness to act.
So it's less about filtering information and more about guiding action. Very interesting. Now, Sebastian Watzel takes this even further with his idea of general-purpose prioritization.
Watzel argues that attention is basically a general mechanism for selectivity. It's not tied to any specific type of process. It's what allows us to prioritize one thing over another for all sorts of reasons, whether it's because of processing limits, because we need to execute a plan or whatever. He sees attention as imposing a prioritization structure on our entire mental life.
It's like attention is the ultimate decision maker in our minds.
Exactly. And he even makes the strong claim that attention is actually necessary for what he calls creature consciousness, though as you might imagine, that's a claim that's generated a lot of debate. But the key takeaway here is that attention, in this view, is about establishing what's important in our mental landscape at any given moment.
It's the gatekeeper of our mental resources. Now let's move on to some more recent, perhaps a bit more technical approaches to attention. Starting with precision optimization theories and prediction error coding. This sounds like it comes from a very specific perspective on how the brain works.
It does. It's based on this Bayesian view of the brain, where perception and cognition are seen as processes of constantly making predictions and then updating those predictions based on sensory information. The key concept here is prediction error, which is the difference between what our brain expects to happen and what actually happens.
So where does attention fit into this picture?
Well, these theories say that attention is all about adjusting the weighting or the precision of these prediction error signals. Precision refers to how reliable the signal is expected to be. For example, our visual information about location is usually more precise than our auditory information. That's why we experience the ventriloquist illusion, where we perceive the puppet's mouth as the source of the sound, even though it's coming from the ventriloquist.
So our brains are basically placing bets on which sensory information is most trustworthy.
Exactly. And attention helps us optimize those bets by adjusting the weighting of the different signals. If the visual cues are unclear, our attention might shift to give more weight to the auditory cues. And some proponents of this view go so far as to say that attention is nothing but precision optimization. But of course, this has been challenged, particularly in terms of how it explains voluntary attention, where our intentions seem to play a more direct role than just the expected reliability of sensory input.
It sounds like a very bottom-up view of attention, driven by the incoming data. It's hard to see how top-down control fits in.
Right. Now let's look at competition theories, which offer a different perspective.
This sounds like it's about how different things in our minds are vying for our attention.
Exactly. Competition theories say that attention emerges from competition between different neural representations in the brain, and there doesn't have to be a fixed limit on processing capacity. A popular model here is the biased competition model, which proposes that top-down signals, like our goals and expectations, can bias this competition. So if you're looking for your friend in a crowded place, your knowledge of what they look like will bias the competition among all the visual information, making you more likely to spot them.
That makes intuitive sense.
Right.
But there are different ways to understand how this competition works, right?
Yes. Some see the source of the top-down signal as the locus of attention, but others, like Christopher Mole with his cognitive unison theory, argue that attention is actually the entire integrated process of competition playing out across the brain.
And what's a core idea behind cognitive unison theory?
Well, it's a bit of a throwback to the views of Locke and Bradley, where attention is seen as a mode of operation rather than a specific set of mechanisms. Mole says attention is the unified activity of whatever mental processes are relevant for a particular task, kind of like an orchestra playing in unison. And an interesting implication of this theory is that full, undivided attention is actually quite rare. Most of the time, our attentiveness is more partial, involving a degree of coordination between different ongoing processes.
That definitely rings true. We rarely achieve that state of complete laser-like focus.
Right. Now, within this general framework of competition, there are also views that see attention as fundamentally about answering questions about the environment.
So it's not just about competition, it's about actively seeking out information.
Exactly. Thinkers like Eilon, Stout, and Corliss argue that attention is how we go about answering questions that are relevant to us at a particular time. And this naturally leads into discussions about things like divided attention, partial attention, and distraction.
All very familiar experiences. Now let's turn to spotlight theories, which are perhaps the most intuitive way to think about spatial attention.
Right. Spotlight theories focus on where our attention is directed, as opposed to what limits our processing capacity. The idea is that our attention is like a spotlight that can move around and focus on different locations in our visual field, or even in our environment more generally.
And there's certainly evidence for this idea of spatial attention, but it's not as simple as a single spotlight on a single map, right?
No, it's much more complex. Studies with patients who have unilateral neglect show that attention is allocated relative to different frames of reference, our body, objects in the world, and so on. And it's not just about location either. Other properties of stimuli like shape, color, and even learned meaning can influence where our attention goes. So the spotlight metaphor captures something important, but it's an oversimplification.
Okay, and our final stop on this theoretical tour is motor theories. These link attention directly to our movements, right?
Yes. There's a lot of evidence for an overlap between the brain areas involved in controlling eye movements and those involved in visual attention. Motor theories propose that attention often involves the activation of, well, sort of mini versions of the motor commands that would actually move our eyes. It's like preparing to act, and this preparation directs our attention. This actually goes back to ideas from the late 19th century, with Alexander Bain suggesting that attention involves motor control processes that stop short of the actual movement.
Interesting. So it's not just about looking, it's about preparing to look.
Exactly. And it's not just about eye movements either. Broader action-based theories emphasize a more general link between attention and motor control. Like the way you intend to grasp an object can influence where your attention is focused on that object. But motor theories also have their limitations. It's not clear how they can explain non-spatial forms of attention, or attention in other senses where the orientation of the sense organ isn't as clear-cut as it is with vision.
It's a good reminder that even our most promising theories often have their blind spots, so to speak. Well, that was a whirlwind tour of the major theories of attention. Now let's dive into some of the key explanatory roles that philosophers have assigned to attention, starting with its relationship to consciousness. This is a pretty contentious area, right?
Oh, absolutely. One of the big debates is whether attention is actually necessary for consciousness. Some say we can be conscious of lots of things we're not paying attention to, while others argue that attention is a prerequisite for anything to enter our conscious awareness.
And the inattentional blindness and change blindness experiments, like the famous gorilla one, are often cited as evidence for the necessity of attention.
Right. But we have to be careful about how we interpret those findings. Just because someone doesn't notice the gorilla doesn't definitively mean they weren't conscious of it at all. Maybe the difference it made to their experience was somehow fleeting or unusable or immediately forgotten. Maybe it's more like inattentional amnesia than a complete lack of consciousness. It's surprisingly difficult to rule either interpretation out.
It's a bit like that refrigerator light illusion, isn't it?
Mm.
We assume the light's on when the door's closed because it's always on when we check, but the act of checking changes things.
Mhm.
Similarly, maybe attention is what brings something fully into consciousness, even if it was there in some minimal way before.
Exactly. And then there are these theory-driven approaches. Prinz, with his late selection view, actually thinks attention is a key part of explaining how consciousness arises. But others, like Mollet, say that when we fail to notice something, it's not necessarily because we weren't conscious of it, but because our lack of attention creates an epistemic deficit. It makes us unable to report on what we were conscious of. And then there are potential counterexamples, like Bloch's work on identity crowding and peripheral vision, where he argues we can be conscious of multiple things without attending to each one specifically. So, yeah, the debate about necessity is far from settled.
Okay, so it's not clear whether attention is necessary for consciousness.
Right.
What about the other direction? Is it sufficient? Does attending to something guarantee that we're conscious of it?
Well, some, like Declan Smithies, argue that everything we attend to is consciously attended to, and he links this to our rational access to our experiences. But there's evidence that we can attend to things without being conscious of them. Like, studies using subliminal priming show that attention can be directed to stimuli that people report not seeing. And there's a whole debate about whether attention is even required for an experience to justify a belief.
So the relationship between attention and consciousness is more complicated than a simple one-to-one mapping. It seems like there are good arguments on all sides.
Right. Now let's shift focus to the connection between attention and demonstrative reference, how we use words like that to pick things out in the world.
So like when I say that cup, my attention is what makes it clear which cup I'm talking about.
Exactly. John Campbell and even Bertrand Russell at one point thought that conscious attention to an object was crucial for knowing what demonstratives refer to. Campbell argued that the validity of arguments using demonstratives depends on the reference staying fixed, and attention is what ensures that. So if I say, that is red, and then that is round, the that needs to refer to the same thing throughout, and attention, for Campbell, is what keeps it locked on.
But there's a classic problem of circularity here. Kutch pointed out that saying something is attended to might not really explain anything. It could just be a placeholder for the very relationship between thought and perception that we're trying to understand.
Right, but Imogen Dickey has offered a way to get around this circularity by using ideas from cognitive psychology, specifically object tracking. She argues that the mechanisms of attention that allow us to track a moving object help to anchor our demonstrative thoughts to those objects, making our references more reliable.
So we're borrowing tools from cognitive science to tackle philosophical problems. Now, this connection between attention and reference seems to be really important for understanding other minds too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Developmental psychology has shown a strong link between the development of attention-related abilities, particularly joint attention, and the development of our understanding of other minds. Being able to see what someone else is paying attention to is crucial for understanding their intentions, what they're trying to communicate.
There's that classic developmental pathway where infants first learn to attend to their caregivers, then to what their caregivers are attending to, and finally, they engage in joint attention with shared focus and understanding. It's amazing to see how these abilities unfold.
Yeah, it really suggests a deep connection between attention and social cognition. And philosophers have offered different accounts of what this sharedness of attention actually involves. Peacock emphasizes the role of reciprocal recognition and common knowledge, while Campbell focuses more on the idea of a shared subjective experience.
But, of course, there are challenges here too, especially in trying to pin down exactly what this sharedness means.
Right. This all ties into bigger debates about theories of perception and the nature of shared intentionality.
Okay, let's broaden things out a bit and consider the relationship between attention and knowledge more generally.
Well, there's this long tradition of connecting attention to our ability to make epistemic moves, to actually gain knowledge and understanding. Descartes saw it as crucial for grasping clear and distinct ideas, Stuart for memory, Kant for controlling our representations. And even without getting into specific theories, those inattentional blindness experiments have a parallel in a priori reasoning, where we might miss a step in a logical argument if we're not paying attention.
Right. And there's a debate about whether failing to attend to something explains why we don't form a belief about it, or whether unattended experiences can still somehow provide justification for our beliefs.
And it's important to note that the attentional requirements for knowledge go beyond just being alert. You can be looking right at something, but if you're focused on the wrong aspects, you're not going to learn the intended thing.
It's about focusing on the right things, not just being awake.
Exactly. Interestingly, there hasn't been as much philosophical work on what we might call purely intellectual forms of attention, the kind we use for abstract thought and problem solving, as opposed to perceptual attention. Some philosophers have argued that this focus on perceptual attention might actually be skewing our interpretations of some empirical findings, and it might have implications for debates about the transparency of phenomenology and how we know our own thoughts.
So we need to be careful about assuming that what we know about attending to the world also applies to attending to our own thoughts.
Right. Finally, let's touch on the link between attention and voluntary action.
This is another area that's been somewhat neglected in recent empirical research, hasn't it?
Yeah, but if we go back to James, we have his strong claim that volition is essentially just attention. And the separation we often make between attention and perception and action might be artificial, especially when we consider our awareness of our own bodies. There's a close connection between our body image and how we direct attention and bodily awareness.
So perception and action are intertwined when it comes to attention. Now, beyond the individual level, attention also shows up in discussions of value in a broad sense.
Absolutely. Even though it's not as prominent as some other topics, it pops up in all sorts of value theoretic contexts. Like in aesthetics, there's the idea of aesthetic attention, this particular way of attending that's thought to be involved in appreciating art and beauty. Some even define aesthetics in terms of this special kind of attention.
So it's not just about passively taking in beauty, it's about actively engaging with it.
Exactly. And thinkers like Weil and Murdoch have highlighted the ethical importance of cultivating certain forms of attention, arguing that duty can help us develop them.
It's like attention itself can be virtuous. What about in ethics more broadly?
Well, Peter Goldie, for example, has argued that attention plays a crucial role in shaping our emotional responses and in the development of moral virtues.
How we attend to things influences our moral character.
Right. And then there's the social and political dimension of attention, which is becoming increasingly important in our information-saturated world.
Ah, yes, the attention economy.
Exactly. The idea that human attention is a scarce resource that's being commodified has sparked a lot of philosophical discussion. People are using all sorts of frameworks to understand this shift. From Marxist ideas about value to discussions of noxious markets, the role of attention in social recognition, respect, and even political engagement is also being explored. And we see discussions about resistance to the demands of the attention economy, like the how to do nothing movement.
So attention is not just a personal matter, it's a social and political one as well. Wow, what a journey. It's amazing to see how such a seemingly simple thing, something we do all the time, turns out to be so complex and so deeply connected to all these other areas of philosophy.
It really is. And it just goes to show that even the most familiar aspects of our experience can raise profound philosophical questions. And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. Given all these different theories and all these different things that attention seems to be doing, what does it fundamentally mean to pay attention? Is it really one single thing, or is it a bunch of related but different processes that we lump together under this one label? We encourage you to reflect on your own experience of attention and see how it fits with the different perspectives we've discussed.
And for those who want to delve deeper, definitely check out the full entry on attention in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or explore the works of the many brilliant thinkers we've mentioned.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a new appreciation for the complexity and importance of this everyday phenomenon we call attention.
Until next time, keep those minds sharp and those attentions focused.
Or maybe not too focused. Remember, a little mind wandering can be good too.
True enough.
Yeah.
See you next time.